And I have to start by giving my thanks to all three panelists. I think they did an excellent job of providing us a lot of things to think about, hopefully as a group, as this saga sort of unfolds. I'm going to turn it over to Anthony. I think we have about 20 minutes for questions,
We've got
Anthony.
plenty of time, yes.
Excellent. That was my plan.
Thank you, everybody. That's wonderful. Now, have we any questions? Any questions in here? No. Any questions in gold?
No questions in gold.
Any questions in colonial? Okay, I can see Sandy moving forward, but I'm going to just say something quickly. I've been to a number of presentations on MOOCs. They interest me. Are you a little worried by the fact that they seem, in many cases, to be something that happens and then doesn't seem to happen again? It just, you have a MOOC, you do it, and then it goes away and doesn't repeat it. Am I right?
I'll be worried if that still happens in 10 years. I think we're very much at the beginning of this and people are testing the waters a lot, and also there's a lot of external institutional pressure in some places to try something, throw something at the wall and see what sticks. If nothing sticks in a while, then we're going to have to revisit this and we're going to have had a massive determined failure.
But it does stick, doesn't it? I mean, it sticks because of the feedback you get. But then why don't you do it again? Are you doing yours again, Lynn?
We are doing it again. I think we need to enlarge our audience if we want to do the same course again, because I think we probably tapped out the Wake Forest alumni audience, so now we have to find a way to make it larger. I will say, though, that Coursera and others have repeated some of their MOOCs. I know that the first one I took has been offered again, and but I do think I agree with Meredith is that we're in this intense experimentation stage, and I think it's okay to go from one thing to another to keep evolving to get to a more successful model.
And I'd just like to add that I think the attrition rate among MOOCs themselves as entities is in some ways similar to the attrition rate that we see among MOOC students, where, like Meredith said, you may be talking about 10,000 students. When you talk about an attrition rate of 90 or 98 or even 98%, I think you worry more about that rate in a system that is not as scalable as MOOCs are. The fact that MOOCs scale so well and so easily means that I think we should worry much less about rate than we should about raw numbers. If 10,000 or even 2,000 students successfully complete a MOOC, that MOOC was exceptionally successful, whether those 2,000 or 10,000 students represent 1% or 50% of the total number who enrolled. And I think a similar consideration applies when we talk about MOOCs themselves. If 1,000 MOOCs emerge in a year, and at the end of that year only 20 of them are still operating, and those 20 are successfully teaching between 500 and 2,000 students, that is a huge development, regardless of what the actual percentages are.
Well, I'd just like to add as a comment there, if you take that paradigm that Rick has just described and you apply it to, let's say, the World Wide Web, for example, what percentage of information there is really useful in any way?
What is the impact then?
Exactly. So I think that phenomenon that he's just described is not restricted in any way to MOOCs. We're going to see it increasingly in a wider variety of things that are impacting our culture in other ways just outside of higher education.
Thank you very much. Sandy.
This is a question, Sandy Thatcher, formerly Penn State Press. Question for Rick, but I'd welcome answers from anybody in the panel. And the question is this: what do you think of the hypothesis that one primary effect of MOOCs may be to widen the gap between the elites and the non-elites among universities? And by that I mean that the Ivies are going to continue to stress that their low faculty student-faculty ratios, their personal experience type of education in small seminars and so on. The pressures of state universities like yours and in the state where I now live in Texas where the governor wants to have a $10,000 education for 4 years, you know, puts emphasis on providing courses like MOOCs offer at very, you know, a cheap way to educate a lot of people.
Right.
So it seems to me that this potentially widens that gap.
So my quick answer to that is, if the gap widens because the elite universities go up and the state universities go down, I have a problem with that. If the gap widens because MOOCs bring the state universities up but bring the elite universities up farther, I have no problem with that. Which of those might emerge is an open question.
Well, I wanted to comment on that also. Wake Forest is ranked 23 in U.S. News and World Report, national universities. And what I see is that everybody above us is doing a MOOC. Everybody below us, their students are taking MOOCs. Where does that leave us? If we're left out of that, we're on this island that's going to float away. So I think that's very relevant. And I think some people say that the top institutions are trying to kill the competition. If there's only going to be a few who will survive, they're going to be the ones to survive. And I want to be one of those survivors.
Okay, now, any questions from Colonial? Any questions from Gold?
No questions from Gold.
Okay, I have a question then. Are there librarians here that think that doing MOOCs or facilitating MOOCs is a bad or a good use of their time? Anybody like to say anything about that? Have I got any takers? Because it seems to me it's a relatively new area for librarians. Of course, they've always taught something, you know, into the faculty, to the students, but the going outside in this way is relatively new, I think. And anybody, well, let me ask you this question. Can you justify this easily within the hard press? Librarians are having a terrible time, huge pressures on them, people being fired, everybody, you know, suffering. Why do you start doing MOOCs?
I'll answer that because we have 55 people on our staff. It's not a huge staff. We have one person who's devoting much of his time to doing this. But I think if we don't do it, we risk becoming irrelevant and we risk not having a future at all.
Also, MOOCs make the case for the continuing relevance of higher education and of libraries to the general public in much the same way that OA does, not actual public access for people who don't have institutional affiliations, not talking about who's funding what within the traditional academe, but if we're trying to make the case to the general public who's been out of school for 20, 30, 40 years that what we're doing is important and relevant in their lives, we need to start talking to them.
And I'll just add, I think that the answer, why do you do MOOCs, if you're a library, why do you do MOOCs in an atmosphere of constricted resources? The answer is the same as the answer would be to the question, why do you do anything in the library in an atmosphere of constricted resources? And that is, you do it because you feel that it's more important than something else that you could be doing instead. And that should, the problem is that we should be applying that same logic to everything that we do, not just new things that come down the road, but the things that we're doing today. We should apply it to journal check-in. We should apply it to traditional collection development. We should apply it to reference service.
Yeah, okay, I just want to make clear that I was acting as a devil's advocate here. It's not, okay. Sheila, please go ahead.
Sheila Correll, University of Pittsburgh High School. It's really just a response to Anthony's challenge there about whether librarians, you know, felt strongly one way or the other. I was interested. I have an academic libraries course, which I am teaching this semester. And I have 40 students taking that, 20 of those on campus and 20 online. And one of the assignments I set was to invite the students to write a paper on the higher education context and issues in the current environment that are having an impact on libraries and likely to do so in the future. And they had to do a sort of brief review of what they thought were the key trends, then select one to explore in depth and discuss that. And it was interesting that out of that class, I think there were half a dozen chose MOOCs as their issue that they thought were worth exploring. And several of those linked that to the need for librarians to demonstrate the value that they added, the value of academic libraries and the value of librarians. And they were picking up a lot of the points that have been mentioned about opportunities for libraries and what they could do. And I thought that was interesting that so many of them, relatively out of that class and the number of things they could have chosen, actually chose MOOCs.
That's very helpful and interesting. Any comments on that? I mean, are librarians being taught this? Are librarians being taught about MOOCs? I know most librarians in the UK are not taught about things like data. I bet none of them are being taught about MOOCs, but in this country, are your instructors in library school teaching about MOOCs? Anybody know? Where's Mr. Professor Holly? Yeah, are you teaching about MOOCs in your institution?
I'm going to do it now.
Are you?
Yeah, I just decided I got some space in my syllabus, so I'm going to do it when I get back.
Okay.
We're so pleased.
Okay, we have a questioner here.
Hi, I'm Lisa Hooper from Tulane University down in New Orleans. I apologize for coming in late. I think I missed a lot of really good stuff, and I'm sad for that. But in the last presentation, you had a list of some of the problems facing libraries and MOOCs, and one of the many things that you highlighted were issues of licensing. And I think that's fantastic for librarians to become involved in MOOCs and embed ourselves in MOOCs for other classes, but who is leading the discussion on these licensing issues? Is it the industry? Is it librarians? Are teachers even thinking about it? Who is leading that right now? And I'm hoping you're actually the one who's leading it.
No, I'm not. And honestly, I'm not sure that there is an organized discussion on the topic yet. There may be one of which I'm not aware, and I would love to be made aware of it. I suspect, and I'm about 80% confident, that to the degree that the conversation is happening, it's happening on a very ad hoc basis. But I think that one of the reasons the conversation isn't really prominent is that I suspect, and I have reason to suspect, that an awful lot of MOOC instructors are limiting their readings to publicly available content. They are very consciously limiting their syllabi in that way. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not sure. I think that, well, no, I'm here to say that's not a good thing. I think that what would be much more effective for the students would be if the instructors were actually taking that step of saying, wait a minute, maybe there's licensed content that I can use. The problem is, once you start including licensed content, you are effectively limiting the potential pool of students. So even as I'm talking, I'm going back and forth on this.
At the OCLC symposium on this last March, with the caveat that from March to November is eternity in internet years, some of the people spoke to this. Harvard X was very explicitly limiting their content only to open access as a matter of policy. But the other people who were talking said they were, usually it was the scholarly communication department at the university that was leading this conversation, and they said they had tried to include licensed content, but in most cases they just couldn't get a response. It wasn't even a no response, it was a no, we don't know who handles this, pocket veto. The only real effective exceptions they were getting there was when the instructor wanted to use their own traditionally published material and could contact their own publisher with whom they had a relationship. Now, since then, there have been these pilots led by the MOOC providers with various publishers to negotiate testing. I think that really hasn't come from the individual university. It's come between the publishers and Coursera and edX.
My only comment was the risk that the publishers run is becoming irrelevant if there are not more effective partnerships to, if students are taking MOOCs and they become an important tool, which I believe they may very well be, if your content's not there when 100,000 students are taking Econ 101, your textbook just isn't that important anymore all of a sudden.
This is a follow-up on the licensing question. The question to you is this. You talk about open access, but some open access done under Creative Commons license that CC BY NC raises the issue of whether the use by a MOOC provider who is a commercial company is a commercial use. What's your answer? It's being used in an educational context, but the company that's providing is commercial. So I don't think that's an easy question to answer.
No.
Okay, just checking upstairs first. Anybody upstairs? Gold?
No questions.
Have you got anybody there still? Yes?
Yes, we
Oh,
have
yeah,
people
good.
here.
You stick. What about, is that Glenda? Yes, it is Glenda. And what about Colonial?
No, we don't have any questions, Anthony.
Okay, now please go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks. Heather Staines from SIPEX, and I just had to follow up on the licensing question because it's crazy. And the communications that we're having are not just with publishers, because a lot of times the older, more classic content, particularly literature, that the professors want to use in the courses is no longer controlled by the publisher, so then you're back to like the large agencies. And they're like, MOOC? What? And then in some high-profile courses we've worked on, it's actually the estate. Try explaining a MOOC to the Winston Churchill estate. Now, in all fairness, they went for it.
They're here.
They were willing to, like, you know, go for it, and, you know, we applaud them, but it's a long conversation because it does typically come back with, okay, that's going to be $85,000 for those students. And then we say, okay, it's not required. This is a free course. This is for the students who want to purchase. But publishers are starting to open up to this. So the conversations now are much easier than the conversations were in December of last year. And it's heartening that publishers are willing to experiment. And the licensing, I mean, I would say if I got a piece of content and it had a CC by NC, I would go to that publisher. I mean, we want to make sure in all cases that we're covered. But it brings up a lot of interesting questions, you know, about what the publisher business model is and such, but it's a brave new world.
And for those who don't know this, a lot of people here I'm sure do, but for those who don't know, Heather works for a company called SIPEX that does basically disintermediated by the article access on behalf of end users in cooperation, I want to make sure I'm summarizing this the right way, in cooperation with libraries typically.
Yes.
But when Heather talks about our conversations, she's talking about conversations between her company and publishers. And SIPEX wants to make it possible through their product, their service, for students to get this access to non-licensed content that's under copyright.
Yes.
Yeah.
You didn't even have to say that, Heather. Isn't that a wonderful thing? So, thank you very much.
you.
And the lady here who's got a question.
Melissa Belvati from University of Prince Edward Island in Canada, which is relevant. The international aspect of the copyright issues and the licensing issues, Canada already has, as of some recent changes in the last year, much more liberal concept of fair dealing than the U.S. fair use, and it's being discussed among academic librarians right now as to whether MOOCs in Canada could actually provide entire journal articles without any permission at all. The law is at the point where it is actually a debatable issue. And if you go even beyond Canada to other countries around the world which have very limited intellectual property protection, what might be the issues where, you know, an American university might be able to partner with a university in another country to make sure the data and the course is being served out of servers in that country, and that might change the whole game.
So
I'm not a lawyer.
things are becoming
I would
incredibly...
suggest you talk to one. I recommend Kevin Smith. Is he here?
No, Kevin's gone. He
Okay.
came on Wednesday. He was
Murkier
here.
by the moment.
Yeah, too busy to stay here, I'm afraid. No. Okay, John, you have a question.
Yes, as I mentioned, all of us should be taking a MetaMOOC, and I took mine on behalf because Mike Sweet asked me to take a MOOC and then report back what it was like. So then we both learned about a lot of this stuff. So I'm just going to mention a couple of things that I've learned that we haven't touched on. Some of it comes from interviewing Daphne Kohler, who's one of the co-founders of Coursera. And she was very excited to say that it was their 5th quarter, and this was just in June, that they now had $250,000 worth of revenue. It all came from a little bit of tweaking some of the authentication schemes. So now you type in, a sentence or two, and they can tell that it was you who was typing. Of course, they can't tell that your brother might have been in the next room reading you all the answers, but whatever, they get $39 from that, and that added up to $250,000. Now, that doesn't support 40 people, but she says that she has like 20 or 30 other business plans in terms of monetizing this. However, she's pretty firm about the fact that her audience is not the traditional American higher ed student. She's on this worldwide mission of what it means for all kinds of people around the world, and the whole third world and places where, yes, there's internet connection, but almost no infrastructure for higher education. And to be able to provide this, I think, is a really significant part of the MOOC question. There's a very good extended section in the most recent issue of Scientific American on the whole question of education technology and in particular MOOCs, and I highly recommend it to everyone. It's, and indeed, all of you should get in there and take your MetaMOOC.
Now, any other questions from upstairs? Gold?
No questions.
Colonial? Well, I think just want to say one thing. The company the organization which somebody mentioned in the UK, I'm trying to get out of the light, is called Future Learn, and it's got quite an interesting site. Now, Future Learn is actually a private company, but it's wholly owned by the British Open University, which has been in this sort of similar sort of business for many years. It's well worth looking into. It's quite, I think they're making a real investment in this, okay? So I want to now thank everybody on the panel and all the audience for staying, rewarded.
Thank you.
And enjoy the conger eel this evening, okay?